Hey everyone, today's conversation is going to be really, really fun. We're going to talk a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're going to talk about social determinants of health. We might get a little bit into health advocacy. We're going to talk about disparity in research. Has been really, really hot recently. So it makes sense to discuss what's going on there. I think yesterday's news was the government just put out a 400 something page report on diversity, equity, inclusion in the context of clinical research. So if you are in clinical research, if you are medical affairs and you're looking over things like investigator-initiated studies, you should probably care about this topic. And that's the topic for today's discussion. Our guest is the CEO and founder of Ethical Research Solutions. She's also an adjunct faculty member for George Washington University. She can be reached at this LinkedIn feed right here, and I'll make sure I put that out. It's the LinkedIn link. It's linkedin.com/in, and then Dr. Sandy Brooks DPS. She can also be found on her email at sbrooks@ers-hq.com. This is the Darshantalks live stream, and I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. I do want to emphasize I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, I advise companies with FDA-regulated products, but I'm not your attorney, I'm not your pharmacist, so this is neither legal advice nor clinical advice, and Sandy is not giving you any advice either. This is just considerations that may or may not be right for you. They do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the host, the guest, our clients, our employers, or the like. If you like what you hear, please leave a comment, please subscribe, please share. Feel free to ask our guest questions. I know she'd appreciate that. I know I'd enjoy that. You can always reach out to me on Twitter at Darshantalks. Go to my website, darshantalks.com. And you can reach Sandy, like I just mentioned, at sbrooks@ers-hq.com. Or you can find her on LinkedIn at Dr. Sandy Brooks DPS. Sandy, thank you so much for coming on. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate it.
No problem. It's been a few months since I've had you, and it's been a very quiet area, right? Like no one's talking about equity or diversity. That's just not a topic that comes up anymore.
Right. Well, because COVID took over, right? Everyone's focused on COVID and the pandemic. But even with that, you still have diversity and health equity issues as a subtext of the COVID pandemic. Unfortunately, it's not as provocative as most people think.
Well, I would actually disagree with you. I would actually say that it is incredibly important. And I think that people are realizing because of COVID how important this topic is. I tried to be funny and that failed miserably, as you can tell. But let's actually define some terms, because I've thrown out a few different buzzwords that people who are not in the industry or in the industry and not necessarily dealing with these topics may or may not be aware of. Specifically, and so if you could define them, I think that'll be very, very useful. So the first term that you talked about was health disparity. What does that mean?
That is a very good question. Health disparities is literally the unequal access of certain diseases within a population. For example, the infant mortality rate for Black and brown infants are usually higher than white counterpart infants. Also, another very common disparity is that Caucasian women are highly diagnosed with breast cancer. However, it's African American women that are more likely to die of breast cancer. So that discrepancy in data, when you have a common thread of disease, is what a disparity is.
That's very interesting. Now, you mentioned a important word there where you talked about Black and brown. Is there a reason we focus on Black and brown as opposed to all non-white minorities?
I think it's just very common with the United States to focus on Black and brown because those are the faces that you see. But in academia, what we really say is white and non-white, right? Because we realize that it is the minority group that is non-white that is impacted by certain health issues.
So it's really interesting. So we draw that distinction, Black and brown, and then we say what we really mean is white and non-white. But then you actually pointed out this idea of male versus female as well, and there's been a growing list of information where there are more women, so they may not necessarily even qualify as a minority from that perspective, but there is a health disparity associated with that. So how could you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, so that goes into race and ethnicity,
Yeah.
right? And race is a social construct. And I think once we realize that race is a social construct within our society, then we can delineate between what is actually a racial disparity versus what is an ethnicity genetic element that may have carried on through genetics and generations.
So what I'm hearing is there's so much we don't know because this is such an intricately woven area that as you start pulling in one thread, all these other threads start coming apart. Um, and I'm sorry, I'm
This is very
trying.
important, right? Because if you conflate the terminology, right, you conflate the arguments and you
Yeah.
conflate the issues. So when we speak of these issues, we try to be very precise within our fields and our discipline so that we're speaking a very common language.
Which I think is really interesting. Like you just mentioned this term, obviously we've all heard this 1,000 times, but race is a social construct,
Mhm.
which seems so obvious. But yesterday's news, and I don't know if you caught this, was that artificial intelligence is now looking at, I think it was X-rays or MRIs or something, and can tell the race of the individual
Mhm.
without getting anything more, which tells me that a lot of biology is simply things we don't understand,
Absolutely.
and it's just not been enough research done into it. Like we are still in the infant phase of understanding health,
Mhm.
and we literally threw a computer at the same problem we thought we'd solved, and it goes, you don't understand what we're talking about.
Because we eliminate the human factor of it
Yeah.
all,
Yeah.
right? And when we're talking about health and wellness, we look at it through a risk-based paradigm, right?
Okay.
Of it is the patient's fault that they're unwell. It's the patient's fault that they're unhealthy. They are the individuals that chose to eat the pizza over the apple or the vegetable,
Yeah.
and is a very common stigma. Not realizing that health, especially in this country, is really a privilege, right? You have to have access to those foods. You have to have access to health care. If you are unable to go to the doctor because you lack insurance or a method of payment, you have to suffer with a long-term chronic illness such as asthma, common flus and colds. People in certain communities have to suffer with longer because they do not have the ability to actually pay. And people lose the human element of it all, that social construct of it all. It's just very easy to put a pill or surgery as a solution when it's so much more complex than that.
Which is so interesting to me because COVID did that in such a serious way. It exposed our vulnerability. One of the key ways it did that is initially when COVID started. I mean, our healthcare system is based on the idea that your employer will give you your healthcare.
Mhm.
And then in the early parts of COVID, giant swaths of people got laid off
Yeah.
at a time when they needed the healthcare the most. So the question then became, what is our solution to healthcare? What is our solution to getting access to treatment? And that's landed up exposing this health disparity, this
Mhm.
access to healthcare. So I mean, you and I were talking about this very briefly right before we jumped on. And one of the things we mentioned was you're starting off your business. It's relatively new, and one of the things
Mhm.
we were discussing is health insurance. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm paying for my health insurance. You're paying for your health insurance, and we're privileged to be able to at least be able to afford it.
Right.
And the fact is that there are people who are less privileged than us that are starting businesses going, my choice is either pay for myself, pay for my food, or no insurance at all, or get insurance. And we know which choice they're making because they have to. So
Absolutely.
so to me, as the country that encourages entrepreneurship, this seems to be such a glaring problem
Mm.
that I find it fascinating. I don't want to sort of go off on a tangent
But it
talking about.
does seem as a like it's a conflict, right? Like it's really an oxymoron when you're really thinking about it. Like we're in a society where we encourage pull yourself up by your bootstraps, go into the entrepreneurship. Your life is what you make it. But then when you attempt to do so, you end up facing so many different challenges that you didn't even consider.
Yeah.
And I can speak from my own stories. Like I suffer from chronic illnesses, right? Health insurance is a non-negotiable issue for me. Like I have to have it, and I have to be willing to pay for it. And Unfortunately, a lot of people are facing very similar challenges, and they have to sacrifice their health. They have to sacrifice their traditional medicines, and they have to sacrifice visits to their wellness doctor. And that's unfortunate that individuals are having to face that choice.
So we landed up starting with this general topic of let's define terms, and we just sort of got off on a tangent. Let's define a few more terms while we're at it. So we discussed health disparity, and then we start talking a little bit about how this disparity is caused due to people's unique living conditions.
Mhm.
Which brings us to the topic of social determinants of health.
Yeah.
What is that?
That is an excellent question, because some individuals think that, oh, it's just individuals that grew up in a bad neighborhood, right? People think, oh, the social environment that you grew up in, but it's really more complex and compounding than that. Social determinants of health have to do with the violence in neighborhoods. It has to do with access to food. It has to do with religious beliefs, and it also deals with the relationships of families and those dynamics. It has to do with exposure to certain violent crimes and trauma, psychological inputs. All of those things are social determinants of health, and they're ancillary to your centralized clinical healthcare setting.
So you talk about all these things that are so important that determine your access to healthcare, your access to clinical research, and we could talk a little bit about how that access isn't even necessarily a physical thing, how that even affects electronic access, for example. But let me ask you this: how do you balance the need for understanding the social determinants of health of a potential subject and comparing that to their specific needs for privacy? Because let's be honest, they may also not want to discuss it with you. So how do you help these individuals who are going, I want to be part of this clinical study, or I need help, without compromising their need for, I don't want to tell you anything?
Right. That's a very common issue that we face. It's truly a conundrum, especially when you go into the IRB meeting, right? And we have to realize that you have to exercise the autonomy of the individuals that will potentially be enrolled. When I say that, what I mean is that just because individuals may want to restrict what they say doesn't mean you don't offer them the opportunity. It is our job as the IRB, as the researchers, to still give access. It's up to the individual to access it or not. And I think we as researchers need to go in thinking that. I think there's a level of elitism that comes in the area of clinical research, to be honest with you, as this clinical trial is going to provide a benefit in the long term. And so there's this sense that every subject should be altruistic in its nature, when that's not necessarily the case, because it's so compounding than that. If you have a subject that is coming from a underserved community who may not have access to the healthcare system this study is being conducted in, what is the relationship to recruit that person into the system that typically is not welcoming to them in the first place? And that's what we're trying to balance when we have these discussions within the IRB.
Sorry, wrong button.
You keep doing that to me, and I'm like, yeah, looking kind of weird here.
I'm aiming to make you the focus here, so that's the goal. And then sometimes you just hit the wrong button. But which really raises the question that people really need answered. You mentioned the term IRB. Everyone who works in clinical research knows what an IRB is. But I mean, I've spent 20 something years in healthcare and clinical research, and I can tell you, from my perspective, the IRB sometimes feel like a watchdog. Sometimes it feels like the police. Sometimes it feels like the people you need to be scared of. And sometimes they feel like they're the advocates for the patient. What exactly is the role of an IRB? What are you looking at?
You know, that's an excellent question, because I think as IRBs, institutional review boards, let me clarify that, and human research protection programs, HRPPs, have developed a reputation because of the operations of carrying these out. So it does appear on the surface that this is an administrative burden that principal investors have to go through, right? They feel that the applications are burdensome. They feel as if it takes too long. They're really eager to get into their research, which I completely accept and appreciate the sentiment. However, I think we have lost the true scope of what the Institutional Review Board is, which is a regulatory body that must convene to protect the rights, welfare, and safety of human subjects. It's not looking at the PI and the convenience of the PI. It's not looking for generalizable knowledge. It is solely looking for the protections of these subjects, because we have to realize the history that resulted in the IRB, right? The IRB came out of a long litany of history of unethical research and conduct. And we realize as the federal government that there has to be a convened body to protect subjects, because the pure nature of being a subject in a study, you're vulnerable. So you have to have somebody there, if it's a convened board or an individual, to advocate and protect individuals before they enroll.
I mean, I have several questions from this, but let's start with the basic one, which is history. Could you talk a little bit like some of the important pieces of history that come to your mind right now that caused IRBs to be important?
Yeah, the most common trial that I think we all have heard of is the Tuskegee Trial, right? Which was a public health funded trial through the United States that went on for about 50 years, that looked at syphilis within the African American male population in the South. And the carrying out of that study was unethical because the scope and aim of the study was never communicated to the subjects. There was advancement in medical treatments that had occurred during the time the study was actually being carried out, and those treatments were not offered to the subjects. There was a long-term observation till death that was not appropriately communicated, and their vulnerability of being poor within the South was used against them, because they offered them monetary funds to help them enroll, and that was used as a mechanism to encourage them to enroll.
So Tuskegee was the linchpin, for lack of a better term. I mean, there were several. There was the Meadowbrook experiments as well,
Mm-hmm.
problematic, but
And the Dunkirk Code and a lot of history that came out of World War II, or what
exactly
under
right.
in Germany, yeah.
Which really raises so obviously in the context of the IRB, which I don't want to say this in a way that's wrong, but essentially the term IRB tends to be used mostly in the US, primarily in the US. But when you go to Europe and the like, they use the term ethics board.
Mm-hmm.
And we use that term interchangeably. Are those terms actually interchangeable?
That's an excellent question, and I'm glad you asked that, because I literally had this discussion yesterday.
Oh,
Those terms are not interchangeable. To be honest with you, we have a regulatory requirement within the United States that we have to meet. Within the common rule, we have the approval criteria under the 7 and 111, as we say. Those elements have to be met. However, those are not ethical theories. Those are not ethical principles. These are not looking at ethical permissibility. These are foundational regulatory elements that we have to meet. In the context of a convened board, we may address ethical issues. We may talk about access. We may talk about race, and we may talk about financial coercion and all these ethical elements. However, that's not the key scope. The key scope is to look at the regulatory floor, and then we extrapolate further. Unlike international research, they do require an ethics committee, and they want an ethics committee because they need someone to look through the local context and be culturally competent of the targeted population that research will eventually recruit from. And so the dynamic is very different. There's international research that's funded through the federal government here that must go through a local IRB here. However, if you want to actually facilitate this in another country, you will have to get a local ethics committee review prior to starting your study.
so what you're pointing out is that the role of the ethics committee is broader than the role of an IRB. It's not to say that the IRB cannot take on more of a role. It's just that the IRB is statutorily has a floor to what it can look into. And some might argue that there's a ceiling. That same regulation offers a ceiling as well. On the other hand, an ethics board really is looking at the overall context, and it's really hard to define what
it may be until you actually look at the individual protocol. And that will determine the ethical questions we will have to face, and also the cultural competency of the population you will recruit from, religious context. All these things are considered during a true ethics committee review.
Which then brings us to the third piece, which you mentioned, which is the HRPP.
Mm-hmm.
How is that different from an IRB or a ethics committee?
So the Institutional Review Board is a regulatory body that is mandated through the federal government through the 45 CFR Part 46 Common Rule. The Human Research Protection Program is an evolution of an administrative support of the IRB. We will go into other elements such as post-approval compliance monitoring of studies once they have been enrolled. They usually function and execute agreements for inter-reliance of IRBs. As you know, with the Common Rule disseminated in 2018 with the revisions, there's a focus of single IRB review. We do that through reliance agreements. The HRPP will manage that to determine which IRB or record will actually be the lead and who would defer and who would keep records of that. Also, we give advice and guidance to the IRB and IRB chairs. Typically, the IRB members are convening, and this is a collateral duty for them. Most people, unless you're functioning in a private IRB world through a private company, of course, you're hired full-time to function as an IRB member. But in universities and other institutions, this is a collateral duty. They're volunteering to actually convene and be a part of this body, which means they do not have the luxury of digging into the regulatory requirements as we would as full-time professionals. So we will function as advisors and experts on the regulations and even the ethical issues for the IRB during a convened board.
So what I'm seeing more and more of in the US is this idea that you're outsourcing your IRB, but you might be keeping an either in-source and outsourced HRPP that is still working with you as an institution.
That's correct.
What is your role as an HRPP in the context of a IRB that is, again, a centralized IRB?
You know, that's excellent. Then you're functioning more as a administrative support to the external IRB. You're the one that's providing local context to the centralized IRB. You're the one that is functioning with your institutional official. So most institutions hold a
Sorry, I thought I could mute that. That did not work. I apologize. I was hoping you couldn't hear it, but going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's very typical for larger academic universities to hold what is called a federal-wide assurance. This is essentially an assurance, a contract with the federal government that they will conduct research under the ethical responsibilities and regulatory floor of the Common Rule. You can hold an FWA without having your own local IRB. In that case, you will outsource to a centralized IRB. However, you still have regulatory mandates and administrative requirements to keep because you still will have to keep tracking of any reportable events such as serious and continuing noncompliance, unanticipated problems. You're the one that's really working as the conduit between the central IRB and the institution so that way the information is fluid. You're trying to prepare the package with the investigators to make sure all the ancillary reviews are completed as well. The IRB is only one faction of a true research enterprise. So you have to make sure that there's data share agreements if data is going to be transferred. You have to make sure there's export controls, if there's international elements here. Sometimes you're working with European countries, you have GDPR issues. So the university and the FWA will have different arms to help support the ancillary review in preparation to go to the IRB.
So what I'm hearing you say is that the HRPP in the context of these large academic institutions is often called on to support the role of the IRB, but they don't take on the role of the IRB. They're more administrative functions to make the job of the IRB a little bit easier. Is that fair?
That is correct. That's
is
absolutely.
there a regulatory basis for an HRPP, or is that more?
That's an evolution of practice, to be honest with you.
Okay.
It came, I would say, early 2000s when you start seeing more and more institutions building HRPPs, realizing that this body is actually having more responsibilities. There's more research actually coming into the institutions, and having individuals come in and convene and vote at a meeting is not sufficient to keep up the administrative elements that's required. One thing about HRPPs, we have to remain what we say audit ready. So to do that, we have to maintain the administrative records and have them up to date in the event you are under some sort of audit.
So we could keep going. I'm trying to decide if we should. Let's take on one more topic before we call it. We talked a little bit about the idea of health disparity. We talked a little bit about social determinants of health. We talked about comparing that to privacy and seeing how you balance the needs of social disparity with the privacy element. We then discussed IRBs. We talked about ethics boards. What is the difference? And then got into HRPPs, which really takes you to that next level. It's very evident in the way you're talking, which is what is healthcare advocacy? And is that necessarily a role that needs to occur in the context of clinical research?
Oh, absolutely. Well, let's deconstruct that term alone, right? Since we're having to be precise. What do we mean by healthcare advocacy? Because that is multifaceted within itself. Are we talking about the policies related to healthcare? Are we talking about development of resources with healthcare? Are we talking about an actual intervention on behalf of a patient? Are we talking about mobilizing within a community? There's so many different elements of health care advocacy. And I really think it depends on what we want to do when we're talking about that. And we can't just take it as a cookie cutter thing, which I think is very common, right? Because we want things to be sensationalized, right? It wouldn't pick up any kind of viewers if it wasn't. But we have to be very precise and direct on what we're talking about when we talk about healthcare advocacy, and in the context of the healthcare system. And the healthcare system is always viewed as this siloed body, right? That is independent of our actual society, when in fact our society fuels the healthcare system. It fuels how it functions, it fuels how it works, and how the patients will be treated. And we recognize that with the pandemic, when the society ruptured, our healthcare system ruptured, right? And it fed into each other. Unfortunately, now that 2 years have passed, it seemed like the lessons that we learned are not being integrated within the fabric of the healthcare system. And that's due to a lot of barriers, of course. There's always financial issues, there's policy, and there's other agendas at play. But the bottom line is that healthcare and healthcare systems do not function independently. They are truly supported by the society that is in. And until we deal with the social determinants that is impacting the society, you're always going to have negative outcomes of healthcare.
Such a great place to end this, because it tells us we need to have another conversation soon talking about exactly this. Before we go, a couple of things that we should remind people. How can people reach you, Sandy?
You can always find me on LinkedIn at Dr. Sandy Brooks DPS. And also you can reach me via email at sbrooks@ers-hq.com.
Perfect. And one last thing, what would be your parting words for people who are listening in?
I would say realize that healthcare is a privilege, and you always should take into account the surrounding factors of why people are suffering from poor health.
Such a wonderful tone to end this on. Thank you again, Sandy. This was wonderful having you on. I hope we can have you on soon again.
Absolutely.
And thank you again.
Thank you so much.